At 2200 hours on the night of November 27th, 1950, a whistle shrieked across a frozen mountain valley in northeastern Korea, then a bugle, then a shepherd's horn, rattling off the ice walls of the Taebaek peaks, and then, from every ridgeline above a village called Udam-ni, the white slopes seemed to come alive. Thousands of shapes in quilted cotton uniforms rose out of the snow, where they had been lying silent for hours at temperatures that froze a man's breath to his eyebrows. They came down the hills, screaming, blowing whistles, firing burp guns, rolling grenades. The United States Marines on the line opened up with everything they had, and the night turned into a continuous white flash of muzzles and tracers. The Siberian wind was blowing at -20 degrees Fahrenheit. The ground shook. The sky cracked. And across the mountains on the other side of the Korean peninsula, captured only a week earlier by Republic of Korea soldiers, there already existed a document that told the story of this night before it happened. It was a 7-page pamphlet printed by the headquarters of a Chinese army on November 20, 1950. It was the first serious Chinese assessment of the American fighting man, based on the first serious Chinese engagement with him at a place called Unsan. Its central conclusion, in the official United States Army translation now held in military archives, was a single sentence that would be quoted for the rest of the 20th century. Their infantrymen, the Chinese pamphlet said, are weak, afraid to die, and haven't the courage to attack or defend. That was the confident opinion of Chinese field intelligence on the American soldier. It reflected the doctrine under which a Chinese general named Song Shilun had been ordered to march 150,000 men into the mountains above the Chosin Reservoir. And within 2 weeks, every assumption inside that doctrine would lie shattered in the snow. To understand how Chinese planners came to believe such a thing about their opponent, you have to go back 4 years, to the Loess Hills around the town of Yan'an in the summer of 1946. An American journalist named Anna Louise Strong was meeting with the Chinese communist leader Mao Zedong outside his cave dwelling at Yangjialing. She asked him what he thought of the atomic bomb. According to Strong's later memoir, Mao replied with a phrase his interpreter at first translated as scarecrow. Mao stopped him and insisted on a different word. Paper tiger. The official transcript of that conversation, later published in the 4th volume of Mao's selected works, preserves the essence. The atom bomb, Mao said, is a paper tiger which the American reactionaries use to scare people. It looks terrible, but in fact it isn't. From that hillside conversation, a whole doctrine was born. The United States of America was, to Mao, the biggest paper tiger of them all. A country with enormous industry, enormous air power, enormous wealth, but also, Mao believed, enormous softness. He believed American soldiers fought for wages, not for country. He believed they relied on machines because they could not endure hardship. He believed that when pressed hand to hand, in the dark, in the cold, on ground of their enemies' choosing, they would break. By the autumn of 1950, that belief had become the operating assumption of the People's Liberation Army's political directorate and its senior field commanders, as they prepared to intervene in a Korean war that the Americans thought they had already won. The People's Volunteer Army 9th Army Group, the formation sent to annihilate the American forces east of the Korean mountains, was one of the crown jewels of that army. It was commanded by a lean, intense veteran named Song Shilun. It comprised 3 full armies, the 20th, the 26th, and the 27th, and inside those 12 infantry divisions. In total, by the estimates of Western historians, roughly 120,000 to 150,000 soldiers. Many of its senior officers had fought the Japanese. Many had fought the Chinese nationalists through the Civil War. They were hardened, politically reliable, and trusted. They had been trained in night infiltration, in silent approach marches, in the encirclement tactics that had shattered entire nationalist armies on the plains of Manchuria. They were told, as they crossed the Yalu River in secrecy in early November of 1950, that they would be facing American divisions composed of spoiled city boys whose officers rode jeeps and whose infantry would not leave the roads. They went into the mountains of North Korea convinced that one hard blow would shatter the enemy. Their leaders were so confident they did not issue proper winter uniforms to all units. Some regiments entered a Korean November in thin cotton tunics and canvas shoes with rubber soles. The 9th Army Group was going to fight a short war. They were sure of it. The world into which they were marching had been moving fast. 5 months earlier, in June of 1950, the North Korean People's Army had erupted across the 38th parallel and driven the South Korean army and its small American garrison into a desperate pocket around the port of Pusan. General Douglas MacArthur, at the head of the United Nations Command, had reversed that disaster with an audacious amphibious landing at Incheon in mid-September. He had liberated Seoul. He had broken the North Korean army in half. And then, with approval from Washington, he had ordered his forces to chase the remnants across the 38th parallel, all the way north toward the Yalu River that marked the border with China. By November of 1950, the United States 8th Army was pushing up the western side of the Korean peninsula, and the United States 10th Corps, under Major General Edward Almond, was pushing up the eastern side. The terrain of the Taebaek mountain range lay between them like a wall. 50 to 80 miles of rugged, roadless peaks separated the two commands. But MacArthur, in Tokyo, was untroubled. On October 15, 1950, on a tiny Pacific atoll called Wake Island, he had met President Harry Truman face to face and had assured him that Chinese intervention was extremely unlikely, that if it came, it would produce the greatest slaughter, and that resistance across Korea would end by Thanksgiving. On November 24, MacArthur himself flew to the front and told his commanders, in remarks widely reported the next day, that he hoped to have the boys home by Christmas. Back in Tokyo, his intelligence chief, Major General Charles Willoughby, had told him for weeks that only small numbers of Chinese stragglers were south of the Yalu. In reality, by the launch of the Chinese second phase offensive on November 25, around 300,000 Chinese soldiers in 30 divisions would be in position in the folds of the North Korean mountains. Among them, the 9th Army Group, under Song Shilun, was taking up positions in a great horseshoe around an American and Allied force that was about to advance into the northern tip of a frozen high plateau, centered on a man-made reservoir the Japanese had named Chosin and that the Koreans called Changjin. The American force advancing into that horseshoe was unlike any other in Korea. At its core was the 1st Marine Division, reinforced to nearly 25,000 men, commanded by Major General Oliver Prince Smith, a tall, quiet Californian who had taught at the Marine Corps schools at Quantico and was known among his officers simply as the Professor. Attached to him were regimental combat teams of the 7th United States Infantry Division, a battalion-sized unit of British Royal Marines called 41 Independent Commando under Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Drysdale, and several Republic of Korea battalions. Above them all flew the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing with its Corsair fighter bombers, and, critically, its night fighter squadrons. The 1st Marine Division had landed at Incheon in September, retaken Seoul in heavy street fighting, and then been loaded back aboard ships and sailed around the Korean peninsula to the eastern port of Wonsan, and from there sent inland along a single narrow road that climbed more than 4,000 feet into the mountains, passed through the villages of Chinhung-ni and Koto-ri and Hagaru-ri, and ended at a scattering of huts called Yudam-ni on the western shore of the reservoir. But there was a problem. Oliver Smith did not believe what Tokyo was telling him. He had seen the intelligence estimates that his own officers had gathered from captured Chinese prisoners in early November at a place called Sudong. Those prisoners had described regiments, not stragglers. Smith believed that a major Chinese force was waiting somewhere ahead, and he believed that his own corps commander, Ned Almond, did not understand what he was about to walk into. Smith could not simply refuse an order, but he could go slowly, and he did. Through the 2nd and 3rd weeks of November, Smith deliberately advanced his Marines at about 1 mile per day. He built up supply dumps. He insisted that his engineers, under Lieutenant Colonel John Partridge, scrape an airstrip out of the frozen ground at Hagaru-ri, a village that sat at the southern foot of the reservoir and would become, though no one yet knew it, the pivot point of the whole battle. Smith stocked Hagaru-ri with 6 days of rations and 2 units of fire. He wrote a private letter on November 15 to the Commandant of the Marine Corps, saying that airdrop in winter was not a feasible means of supplying 2 regimental combat teams. He positioned his regiments within mutual supporting distance, and he waited. Almond thought his Marine general was timid. His Marine general thought his corps commander was a fool. And in the last week of November, in temperatures that were already dropping toward -20 degrees Fahrenheit, The Siberian cold front came down across the Tibet range, and with it, quiet and invisible along the ridges above the road, came the 9th Army Group of the People's Volunteer Army. November 27th, 1950, began as an ordinary winter day at the reservoir. Some of the American soldiers east of the water were shivering over breakfast cans of frozen beans. Some were checking their weapons, running the oil out of them because the oil had become a thick wax that could lock a bolt solid in the cold. Some were writing letters home to wives and mothers, telling them about the snow and the strange beauty of the frozen lakes. At Udumne, on the western side of the water, the 5th and 7th Marine Regiments were preparing, against Smith's private judgment, to launch an attack the next morning westward, under Ullman's pressure, to link up with the 8th Army over the mountains. On a commanding bluff called Fox Hill, above the pass that the Americans called Toktong, Captain William Barber of Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, was placing 234 Marines, 12 Navy corpsmen, and 1 civilian Korean interpreter into a perimeter that guarded the road below. At Kotori, Colonel Louis Puller, already one of the most decorated Marines in the Corps, was holding the southern end of the highway with his 1st Marines. And on the eastern shore of the reservoir, spread thin between the villages of Sinhongni and Hudongni, was a regimental combat team of the 7th Infantry Division, called 31st RCT, commanded by Colonel Alan McLean and his deputy, Lieutenant Colonel Don Carlos Faith Jr. Their task force numbered around 3,000 men, including Korean soldiers attached to the American units. They too were settling in for what they believed was going to be a quiet winter. The attacks began after dark. At Udumne, the Chinese 79th and 89th Divisions struck the 5th and 7th Marines. At Toktong Pass, the Chinese 59th Division cut the road behind them and isolated Fox Company on its hilltop. Along the eastern shore of the reservoir, the Chinese 80th Division, reinforced by a regiment of the 81st, fell on the soldiers of the 31st RCT. At Hagaruri, the following night, it would be the Chinese 58th Division's turn. At Kotori, and on the road south of it, the Chinese 60th Division was waiting. The trap, laid over weeks of silent approach marches, snapped shut in a single stretch of hours. And for perhaps the first 15 minutes, as the whistles and horns and bugles echoed from slope to slope, the Chinese assessment of the Americans looked like it was going to prove correct. Lines wavered. Outposts were overrun. Command posts were hit by grenade squads. Entire platoons were swallowed. And then the assessment began to fail. It failed first at a shallow fighting hole on the forward slope of Fox Hill, where Private Hector Cafferata of Fox Company and his buddy Private Kenneth Benson, half-dressed because they had come out of their sleeping bags in the middle of the night, were facing an entire Chinese platoon coming up the slope. Cafferata fired his rifle until it jammed with cold. He threw grenades. He grabbed live grenades thrown at him and batted them back at the Chinese with an entrenching tool. When a grenade landed in a trench behind him, among wounded Marines, he reached down and flung it away with his bare hand just as it exploded. It severed part of a finger and tore up his hand and arm. He kept fighting. By daylight, the forward slope was covered with the bodies of that Chinese platoon, and Cafferata was still there. For that action, he would receive the Medal of Honor. He was 21 years old. The assessment failed next at Udumne, where the 5th and 7th Marines, thrown onto the defensive by an enemy they had been told they would attack, steadied their positions and held. It failed at Hagaruri the next night, when a composite force of Marine engineers, military police, headquarters clerks, army signallers, and men of the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, under Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Ridge, held the southern perimeter, while a young major named Reginald Myers led a scratch company of around 250 men up East Hill against the Chinese 58th Division and broke their attack. Myers, too, would receive the Medal of Honor. And the assessment failed, most consequentially of all, because an obscure detail of American planning the Chinese had not understood began to shape the battle. Oliver Smith's engineers under John Partridge had finished enough of the Hagaruri airstrip to take a single Air Force C-47 transport. Supplies could now come in, and more importantly, wounded could now go out. The Chinese had assumed they would starve the Americans in the hills. They had not understood that a narrow strip of scraped frozen dirt inside the Hagaruri perimeter had just changed the arithmetic of survival. The story at the eastern shore of the reservoir was different, and its difference is one of the reasons the battle is still argued about today. The 31st Regimental Combat Team was not the 1st Marine Division. It was an ad hoc formation, stitched together at the last minute out of 2 infantry battalions, an artillery battalion with 2 firing batteries, a company of tanks that never closed up to the main force, an anti-aircraft battery of half-tracks mounting quadruple heavy machine guns and 40mm cannon, and 700 Korean soldiers who had been attached only days before. Its commander, Colonel McLean, was killed or captured on the second day when, attempting to signal what he thought were American troops advancing across the ice, he walked into Chinese fire. Lieutenant Colonel Don Faith took over. On November 28, in the teeth of this disaster, Corps Commander Ned Almond flew in, pinned silver stars on Faith and 2 enlisted men, told the exhausted officers that they were facing only remnants of a beaten enemy, and, in words remembered afterward by several of the men present, urged them not to let a bunch of Chinese laundrymen stop them. Almond then flew out. Witnesses say Faith pulled the silver star off his parka and threw it into the snow. For 4 days, Faith held his shrinking perimeter around Sinhongni with a skill that has been honored ever since. His men and the anti-aircraft half-tracks, turning their quad 50s on the Chinese assaults, tore the Chinese 80th Division to pieces. 2 of its regiments, the 238th and 239th, were reduced to fewer than 600 men combined. But the task force itself was bleeding out. Its artillery was overrun. Its food was gone. Its wounded numbered in the hundreds. On December 1, with no relief coming, Faith ordered a breakout south along the shore road toward Hagaruri. It was a brave attempt, and it turned into catastrophe. A Marine Corsair aircraft, trying to support the column from the air, dropped a canister of napalm that struck the head of the formation by mistake, incinerating the leading squads. The column fought through a succession of Chinese roadblocks. Faith himself was mortally wounded at one of them, within 30 yards of the obstacle, firing his pistol and throwing grenades. He would receive a posthumous Medal of Honor, and the formation he had led would afterward be called Task Force Faith, a name given by an army historian in the 1960s and later popularized by Roy Appelman. When the column finally disintegrated in the dark, survivors, many of them wounded, scattered across the frozen surface of the reservoir itself, walking south on the ice toward the lights of Hagaruri. It was there that Lieutenant Colonel Olin Beale, commander of the 1st Motor Transport Battalion of the 1st Marine Division, drove his jeeps onto that ice, through pools of water where Chinese mortar rounds had cracked the surface, and spent the next 2 days ferrying in broken, frost-bitten, half-frozen army soldiers, 1 at a time and 2 at a time, until around 300 had been pulled from the ice. Of roughly 3,000 men in the task force, only a few hundred would walk off it under their own power. The rest were killed, captured, or scattered. By any ordinary count, the destruction of that task force was exactly what the 9th Army Group had been sent to achieve. It was, at the cost of 1,000 dead, the textual confirmation of the Chinese pamphlet. And then, like a magician's reversal, those same survivors, several hundred of them, were reorganized at Hagaruri into a new provisional battalion issued to the 7th Marines and ordered into the line for what was coming next. It took the Chinese a long time to understand what they had actually won and what they had not. Because even while the task force was being destroyed in the east, something remarkable was unfolding in the hills to the west. The 5th and 7th Marines at Udamni were surrounded. Fox Company on Toktong Pass, 14 miles south, was surrounded. Hagaruri was surrounded. Kotori was surrounded. The road between them was cut in multiple places. By every rule the Chinese planners knew, an army in such a situation should have been unable to move. The proper response, the Chinese had been told at their political briefings, was for the Americans to surrender, or to be overrun, or to flee into the hills and die. On November 29, Oliver Smith received authorization from Tokyo, through Almond, to withdraw his entire command. Smith gathered his senior officers, told them what they already understood, and gave his instructions. They were going to break out. They were going to do it southward down the single road toward the sea. They were going to bring out their wounded. They were going to bring out as many of their dead as they could carry. They were going to bring out their equipment. And they were going to bring out the survivors of the 31st Regimental Combat Team. The soldiers of the Chinese 9th Army Group, watching them from the ridges, were about to see the thing the Chinese intelligence pamphlet had said Americans would never do. They were going to see the enemy attack. That same night, Colonel Puller at Koto Ri assembled a relief column to punch north through the Chinese 60th Division along 11 miles of twisting mountain road, all the way to Hagaru-ri. He gave it to Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Drysdale of 41 Commando, Royal Marines. Drysdale had about 900 men. He had his own British commandos. He had Company George of the 3rd Battalion 1st Marines under Captain Carl Sitter. He had Company Baker of the 1st Battalion 31st Infantry. He had 2 companies from the 1st Marine Tank Battalion, Company Dog at the lead, and Company Baker in the rear. He had dozens of supply trucks. The column stepped off at 09:30 on November 29. Within 3 hours it was in a firefight that has been called ever since the Battle of Hellfire Valley. A Chinese mortar round set a truck on fire halfway down the formation, chopping it in half. The forward group, under Captain Sitter, fought through the roadblocks and reached Hagaru-ri late that night with about 300 men. The centre was forced back to Koto-ri. The isolated elements were destroyed or captured. The total loss on that 11-mile stretch of road was 162 dead and missing, 159 wounded, and 75 burned-out vehicles. But Sitter's column brought into Hagaru-ri something the Chinese had not allowed for: fresh infantry, and with them the perimeter of Hagaru-ri held. In Toktong Pass, Captain Barber of Fox Company was still holding his hilltop. He had been seriously wounded on the second day of the siege, shot through the hip and pelvis, and his corpsman had given him enough morphine to function but not enough to sleep. The morphine syrettes, they had discovered early, froze solid in their pouches and had to be thawed in the corpsmen's mouths before they could be injected. The plasma, the American medics had also discovered, simply became blocks of ice and could not be used on the ground at all. Blood transfusions were impossible. Barber ran the defense of Fox Hill from a stretcher, dragged from foxhole to foxhole. On 5 successive nights, the Chinese 59th Division fed regiment after regiment into the slope. On 5 successive nights, Barber's Marines cut them down with rifle and machine gun fire, directed airstrikes by Marine Corsair pilots, working the hill at bayonet range, and held. Fox Company on that hill lost men every night. It was running low on ammunition and blood. And then, on the afternoon of December 2, Marines came walking out of the hills behind them, from a direction Chinese tactics did not permit. They came from the west. Because the other thing about Americans that the Chinese pamphlet had said was that they could not fight at night. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Davis, a 35-year-old battalion commander of the 7th Marines, had heard that idea about himself often enough. On the afternoon of December 1, Davis gathered his 1st Battalion, roughly 800 men, and told them what they were about to do. Fellow Marines, he said, were in trouble. They were going to go and get them. Surprise was going to be their weapon, because Marines did not usually attack at night, and the Chinese were not expecting it. Davis led his battalion off the ridgeline at nightfall. They climbed in column, in single file, across trackless country in a snowstorm at -20 degrees Fahrenheit. They crossed 3 mountain ridges in the dark. They fought their way through surprised Chinese positions. They paused in the small hours to gather stragglers by counting off numbers because voices could not be distinguished in the wind. By late morning on December 2, they walked up onto the crest of Toktong Pass, and Fox Company, reduced by then to 82 men who could still walk under their own power, cheered them in. It was as clean a feat of winter infantry soldiering as the Marine Corps has ever recorded. Davis would receive the Medal of Honor, so would Barber, for Fox Hill. So would Kafarata, for the Fighting Hole. No small unit in Korea saw more recognition than Fox Company of the 7th Marines, and no officer of the Korean War fought a cleaner tactical action than Davis on that hill. Over the following 2 days, the 5th and 7th Marines, carrying their wounded and their dead, walking and fighting, came down the 14 miles of road from Udamni to Hagaru-ri. They came through ambushes. They came through roadblocks. They came through the long straight stretch of the valley below Toktong, where Chinese machine guns hammered down from the ridges, and Corsair pilots tore those ridges apart in return. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Taplett's 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, led the way at the front of the column. Lieutenant Colonel William Harris's 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines, held the rear guard and fought a running action that is still studied in tactical schools. Harris himself would be killed before the column was out. And at 2 in the afternoon on December 4, the last elements of the column marched into the perimeter at Hagaru Rai in a column of twos, singing the Marines' hymn. It had taken them 79 hours. The men who stood in the snow and watched them come in wept. It was at Hagaruri, on that same day, that a group of war correspondents who had flown in on the airstrip asked Major General Smith whether he had been forced to order a retreat. Smith, whose division was now surrounded at a distance from the sea of 78 road miles, answered them quietly. "Gentlemen," he said, "we are not retreating. We are merely advancing in another direction." The line would pass into American headlines the next morning in a more famous, sharpened form that has been quoted ever since. Smith would later explain what he had meant in a sentence of perfect clarity. "You cannot retreat or withdraw when you are completely surrounded," he said. "The only thing you can do is break out. When you break out, you attack. That is what we were doing." For the next 6 days, the 1st Marine Division did exactly that. It broke out. It attacked south, down the single road, through a Chinese army of more than 100,000 men that had been ordered directly from Beijing to stop it and destroy it. On December 5th, inside Hagaruri, Air Force transports landed every few minutes and lifted out wounded Marines and soldiers, flying them to Japan. Over the course of the operation from the Hagaruri airstrip, more than 4,300 wounded would be evacuated that way. 537 replacements would be flown in to take their places in the line. No previous American battle had ever used air power this way. On December 6th, the column marched out of Hagaruri toward Kotori, with the 7th Marines in the lead, the division train and the wounded in the middle, and the 5th Marines as rear guard. It snowed, the thermometer dropped. The trucks carried dead Marines stacked like cordwood because Smith had told his officers they would bring them out and bury them properly. A photographer named David Douglas Duncan, who had himself been a Marine combat photographer in the Pacific in the previous war, walked that road with them, and his photographs of those frozen trucks and of exhausted men sucking on frozen chocolate bars would become some of the defining images of the 20th century. The 6th combatant in the battle, the one no soldier on either side could fight back against, was the cold. Standard Marine weapons, cleaned of all lubricant and handled with care, still misfired. The automatic rifles, the Browning automatic rifles, froze solid. Veterans in later interviews described urinating on frozen receivers to thaw them because warm urine was the only liquid available, and when the weapon was dry it would fire again. The ground was too hard to dig into. Foxholes were blasted out with explosives. Rations froze into bricks. Men warmed them under their armpits for hours. Morphine froze. Plasma froze. Truck engines had to be idled every hour, or the oil would thicken past the starter's strength. Radios lost their batteries almost as soon as they were switched on. Temperatures on the highest nights reached -36 degrees Fahrenheit, and, on some ridgelines, colder still. The wind at Funchilin Pass on the night of December 8th was remembered by veterans as the worst of the campaign. But the cold that killed American and Allied soldiers in the dozens, and wounded them in the thousands, killed Chinese soldiers of the 9th Army Group in enormous numbers. Because the Chinese marched prematurely out of Manchuria on Mao's orders before winter issue had been completed, had arrived in Korea in cotton. Their uniforms were thin. Their footgear, canvas and rubber, drew heat out of the feet. Their supply columns had been bombed off the roads by American air power on the very day they crossed the Yalu. Their heavy artillery had been abandoned behind them because it could not be moved. Their divisions, officially 10,000 men each, had entered battle at 6,000 or 7,000. In the open, in static blocking positions on ridges waiting for American columns to come past, they simply froze. Chinese accounts, as well as American ones, now describe entire companies discovered still in their firing positions, rifles pointed down the road, dead for hours. These men have become known in Chinese memory as the ice sculptures. The most frequently cited figure is 129 soldiers from 3 companies of the 20th Army, discovered on a single ridge. By December 7th, the column had reached Kotori. There were now about 14,000 men, and roughly 1,000 vehicles, crowded inside a perimeter 2 miles across. Ahead of them, 8 miles south, lay the worst piece of ground on the entire road. The pass, called Funchilin, fell 2,500 feet in a series of switchbacks down the face of a gorge. At one point, The road ran across a concrete bridge above a power station's penstocks, where a gap of roughly 24 to 29 feet dropped sheer to the rocks below. The Chinese 58th Division had blown that bridge. They had blown the improvised replacement the Americans had built in a day. They had blown the second replacement, and now they were holding Hill 1081 above the gorge, with orders to stop the Americans from passing. If the Americans could not cross that gap, the trucks, the tanks, the artillery, and the wounded would have to be abandoned on the plateau. Oliver Smith and John Partridge had thought about this weeks earlier. They had asked for, and now they received, something no army had ever tried. At Yonpo Air Base near the coast, 8 sections of a steel M2 treadway bridge, each about 18 feet long and weighing roughly 2,500 pounds, were rigged with large cargo parachutes. On the morning of December 7th, Fairchild's C-119 flying boxcar transports of the United States Air Force, 314th Troop Carrier Group, flew up the gorge at low altitude and dropped the bridge. One section drifted into Chinese lines. One was too badly damaged to be used. 6 came down intact within the marine perimeter. First Lieutenant David Pepin of Company Dog, 1st Engineer Battalion, working with an Army engineer platoon from the 58th Engineer Treadway Bridge Company, dragged the sections forward, improvised cribbing and plywood panels to extend them across the gap, and set the span in place. While this was being arranged, down at the village of Chinhung Ni at the foot of the gorge, Lieutenant Colonel Donald Schmuck of the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, attacked up the pass from the south. On December 9, his battalion took Hill 1081. When the Marines reached the crest, they found Chinese soldiers still in their firing positions, rifles in hand, already frozen to death. The defenders had held their ground to the last, and the cold had finished the job before the Marines could. The treadway was emplaced by late afternoon that day. Vehicles began crossing within hours. The 9th Army Group was unable to stop them. The Chinese 58th and 60th Divisions between them now mustered fewer than 200 effectives. Through December 10 and 11, the division and its attached units poured off the plateau, down through Chinhung Ni, past Sudong, where the engineer column detonated the treadway behind them as a final act, and onto the flat coastal plain. The 9th Army Group had been ordered to destroy them. It was itself destroyed. Chinese archival figures, published by the People's Liberation Army in 1988, acknowledged 21,366 combat casualties and 30,732 non-combat casualties, for a total of more than 52,000. Western historians, including Patrick Rowe in his study of the Chinese intervention, have estimated as high as 60,000. Of the 8 divisions that opened the battle, 2 had to be formally disbanded, and 5 more were, in the cautious language of American intelligence, for all practical purposes, out of action. The entire Chinese order of battle in Korea fell from 30 divisions to 18 in a single month, because the 9th Army Group had to be pulled out of the line and sent to rear areas for months to reform. At the port of Hungnam, on the coast, the United States Navy was waiting. Rear Admiral James Doyle, aboard the amphibious command ship Mount McKinley, commanded Task Force 90, and over the following 2 weeks, the Navy would carry out one of the most extraordinary evacuations in military history. The 1st Marine Division, having broken out of its encirclement, was loaded aboard transports and sailed south by mid-December. Behind it came the Republic of Korea 1st Corps, lifted out toward the port of Samchok. Behind them came the 7th Infantry Division, and behind them, as a rear guard, the 3rd United States Infantry Division, under Major General Robert Soule. Covering all of them from the sea were the battleship Missouri, the cruisers St. Paul and Rochester, destroyers, and aircraft carriers. Naval gunfire expended during the evacuation was recorded by the Navy at 18,637 5-inch rounds and 2,932 8-inch rounds. Into the perimeter, every night, came tens of thousands of North Korean civilian refugees fleeing ahead of the Chinese. The Navy and the Merchant Marine loaded them. They loaded them into every available space. On December 22 and 23, a merchant freighter called the Meredith Victory, a ship designed to carry 12 passengers and a crew of 47, took aboard about 14,000 Korean civilians. Captain Leonard LaRue packed them into 5 cargo holds that still held hundreds of tons of jet fuel in drums. He packed them onto the deck. He sailed south without adequate food or water or medicine or sanitation or any idea whether he would be attacked by submarines. He arrived at the island of Jeoje on Christmas Day. Disembarkation, accomplished by lowering 16 people at a time on wooden pallets onto landing ships alongside, was completed the next day. 5 babies had been born during the passage. Not a single passenger had died. The Meredith Victory still holds the record for the largest single-ship civilian evacuation in history. Captain LaRue would later say that the hand of Providence had been at the helm of his ship. He would become a Benedictine monk and be known as Brother Marinus. A cause for his canonization has been opened in the Roman Catholic Church. The last American battalion boarded ship on the afternoon of December 24. Navy underwater demolition teams from the attack transport Begor destroyed the harbour installations at Hungnam with more than 20 tons of explosives as the last transports pulled away. In all, the Navy had brought out of the northeast of Korea more than 100,000 military personnel, more than 90,000 Korean civilian refugees, 17,500 vehicles, and 350,000 measurement tons of cargo. Rear Admiral Doyle would later say that, had there been enough shipping, twice that number of Koreans could have been saved. When the last ship sailed, he estimated, as many remained behind on the beach as had been carried out. At the highest levels of the Chinese leadership, the reckoning began almost immediately. Song Shilun, who had led the 9th Army Group, offered his resignation. Mao Zedong, in a telegram on December 17 that has survived in the archives of the Chinese Communist Party, expressed his deepest sorrow for the thousands of soldiers who had frozen to death at Funchilin Pass. Peng Dehuai, the overall commander of Chinese forces in Korea, said publicly, after the war, that the American soldier had been good at fighting. The Chinese historian Xiaobing Li, who interviewed veterans of the 9th Army Group for his study Attack at Chosin, summarized the new understanding in one sentence. Peng and Song, he wrote, found that the enemy was not a paper tiger. The cost of that discovery, on the American and Allied side, was heavy but very different in character from what the 9th Army Group had paid. Official figures, compiled by the Army historian Roy Appleman from Unit Records, record for the 1st Marine Division 604 killed in action, 114 died of wounds, 192 missing, and 3,485 wounded in action, for a total of about 4,385 battle casualties, with a further 7,338 non-battle casualties, most of them frostbite. For the Army units attached, 3,163 battle casualties. For the Republic of Korea, roughly 2,800. For the British Royal Marines of 41 Commando, 78. The 1st Marine Division brought almost all of its dead out of the mountains, many buried temporarily in a mass grave bulldozed at Koto-ri on December 8, where more than 100 Americans, British, and Korean Marines and soldiers were laid to rest in a single trench. Years later, under a project called Operation Glory, in 1954, approximately 4,000 sets of American remains were returned from North Korea. Most of the Chosin dead were identified. A few still lie in the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific above Honolulu as unknowns. New remains continue to be identified to this day. The awards that came out of Chosin tell their own story. As many as 17 Medals of Honor were approved for actions in the Chosin campaign, the highest total for any single campaign of the Korean War, with the core list confirmed by the Congressional Medal of Honor Society at 13 names. Dozens of Navy Crosses and Distinguished Service Crosses were awarded. In addition, Captain Barber received his for Fox Hill. Private Cafferata received his for the fighting hole on that hill. Lieutenant Colonel Davis received his for the night march. Lieutenant Colonel Faith received his posthumously for the Eastern Shore. The British 41 Commando received a United States Presidential Unit Citation. The 31st Regimental Combat Team received its Presidential Unit Citation too, in September of 1999, 49 years late. Navy Lieutenant Junior Grade Thomas Hudner of Fighter Squadron 32 off the carrier later received his Medal of Honor for deliberately crash-landing a Corsair fighter onto a snow-covered mountainside in an attempt to rescue his downed wingman, Ensign Jesse Brown, the first African-American to complete the United States Navy's basic flight training. Brown could not be extracted and died in the cockpit. Hudner lived until 2017 and spent the rest of his life trying to bring his friend home. The veterans of the battle became known as the Chosin Few. They founded their organization in 1983. Their symbol is a single star, called the Star of Koto-ri, because on one of the worst nights of the fighting, a single star had appeared briefly through the overcast above the Koto-ri perimeter, and the men who saw it never forgot it. Memorials to the Chosin few stand in St. Louis and Springfield and Dallas and Ogden, and at the Marine Corps University in Quantico. The United States Navy commissioned a Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser called USS Chosin in January of 1991. A documentary film called Chosin, produced by two Marine infantry officers named Brian Iglesias and Anton Sattler, who had themselves served in Iraq. It was released in 2010 after they interviewed 186 surviving veterans in 27 cities across 14 states. It won the award for Best Feature Documentary at the GI Film Festival in Washington. The surviving veterans are now almost all gone. The youngest of them have reached their 90s. Each year, on November 27, the anniversary of the first night of the attacks, fewer and fewer of them gather at the memorials to remember. The paper tiger doctrine that sent the Chinese 9th Army Group into those mountains did not entirely die at Chosin. Chinese commanders would test it again in the months that followed. In the 3rd and 4th and 5th phase offensives that ran from the last days of 1950 through the spring of 1951, and again they would be stopped. By May of 1951, after the catastrophic Chinese losses of the 5th phase offensive, the idea that one hard blow could shatter the American army would be quietly abandoned in Beijing. The Chinese would instead dig in along ridgelines close to the 38th parallel, and the two sides would grind at each other for 2 more years, until an armistice was signed at Panmunjom on July 27, 1953, very close to where the war had begun. The meaning of Chosin Reservoir, for anyone who wants to understand the 20th century, does not lie in who won the ground. The Chinese took the ground. It does not lie in who achieved the strategic objective. Neither side fully did. It lies in what was disproved there. It lies in the fact that a serious military power, acting on a confident assessment of another, can be catastrophically wrong about the human beings whom that other power sends to fight. The doctrine that had been written into Chinese pamphlets after Unsan, the doctrine that had told Chinese political officers the American infantryman was weak, afraid to die, dependent on his machines, and unwilling to attack or defend, met at Chosin a 1st Marine Division that was none of those things. That division walked 78 miles through a Chinese army of more than 100,000 men. It brought out its wounded. It brought out most of its dead. It parachuted a bridge into a gorge and then crossed it with tanks. It attacked at night, over ridges, without roads. It held hills with its wounded. It refused to do the one thing the enemy had been most certain it would do. It refused to break. None of this proves that courage belongs to one nation more than another. The young men of the Chinese 9th Army Group also showed courage, and they paid for it in ways that Chinese families are still grieving 75 years on. Some of them died in their firing positions because they had been ordered to hold ground at all costs, and they obeyed until their blood froze. That is courage too. Chosin is not a story about one side being brave and the other not. It is a story about what happens when a powerful institution tells itself a convenient story about its enemy, and then meets that enemy on a real battlefield. It is a story about what certainty costs when certainty is wrong. It is a story about how an army, misled about its opponents, can march straight into a catastrophe its own leaders could have predicted from a single honest look at the men across the ridge. And it is a story, finally, about how the quiet professional preparation of one careful division commander, ignored by his superiors and mocked by his peers, can matter more than any doctrine passed down from a distant capital years before. The sentence in the Chinese pamphlet had always been a sentence about the writers, not about the men they described. By the time the last American ship pulled out of the burning port of Hungnam on Christmas Eve of 1950, every competent officer on both sides of that frozen reservoir knew it.